Hi guys, this is Nadia from Imbali Crafts, and today I want to show you how to create soldered earrings using gallery wire. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button to get notifications when I upload new videos. I quite often do kits and PDF tutorials for my videos, so pop over to my shop. I'll put a link in the description and see if there's anything you fancy. Also, if you need any support, I have an artist group on Facebook. Link of this is also in the description. Right, let's get started. So to begin with, we're going to cut a strip of the gallery wire. You can see it's quite soft and malleable, just long enough so that it reaches around the stone. You can kind of measure the stone maybe with a piece of paper first before cutting, but I generally just do it by eye. And you just need to have enough of it so that you can fold it around the stone. So at this stage, it's still quite soft and malleable, but it work hardens pretty quickly, so you need to get the shape right. So what I'm doing here is I'm just squeezing the front together to get the shape of the pear, and this kind of molds the gallery wire around the stone. I want to have just enough of the gallery wire meeting at the tip so that I can later trim it and there's a nice tight fit around the stone. So I'm using my pliers to kind of shape the base. We want everything to be nice and flush so that the stone is kind of wedged into the setting once we have soldered it. So that's what it looks like, and we're going to now trim off the excess. Obviously make sure you don't cut off too much so that the bezel becomes too small. So just need to make sure that it fits still. You can kind of adjust it if it's too long with a bit of a file like I'm doing here, and you also need to make sure obviously that the joints which we're going to solder are nice and flush, because solder will not flow and close up gaps. It needs to have two joints touching for it to be effective. Right, so I'm just shaping it again and I'm squeezing the two ends together, and that's what it looks like. So once I have put the joints together, this is a pen by the way that I'm using, and I filled it with flux. I find this really handy. I used to use a borax, but I find it kind of expands a little too much, so I've got different flux, which is just your normal sort of silver flux, and I've put it in a pen, which is really handy, and we can just paint it on. So here I am taking the solder. I'm using hard at the moment because obviously we're working our way down to the soft solder. I'll explain about this a little more later on. So I've placed the solder underneath the bezel because the heat will draw the solder upwards into the seam, because the solder will follow the heat. So here I am using my torch, and you can see it travels really quickly, heats up really quickly. You obviously just need to be careful not to melt the bezel because it's quite thin metal, and that's what it looks like. You can see how the solder has traveled upwards in the joint. So next I'm placing it into a solution which is just vinegar and salt, which I've heated up, and this is enough. It's a very environmentally friendly pickle, and you can see how quickly it actually changes color. I find it a lot more effective though if it's hot, so I heat it. So you can either put it in a microwave like I do, or maybe get a crock pot specifically for that. So next I am shaping the sort of step where the stone will sit on in the bezel. For that I've cut a piece of 0.8, I think it is, or 1 mil wire. I'll double check that and put it in the description. And all I'm doing here, this is square wire, all I'm doing here is kind of shape that wire to fit the back of the stone. So I'm just using some round nose pliers to get the initial shape, and that will then help me to kind of form the pear. So it needs to be just big enough so it can actually slot into the bezel we have just created with the gallery wire. You can always adjust it, so I always tend to make it a little bit longer than I initially intend to, because I can then cut it down or file it down with some snippers or your flush cutters. So you can see here I'm just gently using the round nose pliers to adjust, kind of check the fit. So far so good. You want to make it the same shape, obviously, because it needs to fit into the pear. So you kind of go by eye. You can draw it on a piece of paper as well if you find that easier to do. I just go by eye. So that seems to be okay. Good fit. So I'm going to double check to see if it already fits in there. You want it to be nice and flush. So what I'm using here are my Tronix ultra flush cutters. These are great because as opposed to flush cutters, these will give you an extra smooth sort of cut. So you still have a little ledge, tiny one, but it's much more flat than you would get with your normal flush cutter. So I love them. They're fantastic. So they're Tronix. All your sort of expensive brands have good quality, and it's definitely worth the investment if you're using it. So I'm double checking here, and it's still a little bit too big. It's easier to trim it down rather than obviously make it longer. So if it's too short, you'd start again. But because it's too long, I'm literally shaving off a tiny amount of each end, and that way you can control that the pear fits. All right, so in this time it seems to fit. So I'm going to take a hard surface. The mat I've got is a little bit too soft. So putting the stone in it, and that way I make sure that the wire that I'm putting in is nice and level with the sort of backing of the bezel. You can see it looks all right. Pop the stone out, and that seems to be okay. So next, obviously, we need to solder that in place. And all we're going to do here is, again, I think I'm using hard solder still. So use different hardnesses of solder when you're stepping down, meaning that the first solder joint is usually hard and the subsequent ones are usually medium and then going down to easy. Just because that you don't want, when you're soldering, your first solder joints to disintegrate when you are heating up the piece to solder the next joint. So I'm using medium actually here. You can see I've got a little box, and this is medium solder, and all I'm doing here is picking up little paillettes. This was wire. I've just cut little pieces off the wire, tiny. Less is more in soldering, I found out, and even what I'm putting on here is actually too much, especially when you are soldering copper, because obviously copper, you still need to use silver solder, and if you use too much solder, what happens is the solder actually travels all over your copper and discolors it. So I've used a little bit too much here. I've managed to clean it up later. So when you soldering, maybe use just 3 or so pieces. That's actually enough to travel in the seam, as long as you kind of heat the piece from the outside and heat it equally so that the solder can travel and follow along with the heat. So I'm just heating it up. You can see the solder, when solder is flowing, you can actually notice soon what the solder looks like when it's hot enough to flow. Gives you a little silver flash. So it's that, and you can see that where the silver is flowing, you can see a little silver seam, obviously, and you can't see it here, but on the outside, once it was cleaned up, the silver traveled all over the gallery wire because I used a little bit too much solder and it kind of messed it up a bit. So less is more, as I said. So again, you can see here I'm putting it into my vinegar and salt. So next, what we're going to do is create the bowls. It's one of my favorite things to do. So obviously you want to make sure you create the same size all of the time. So I've got 2 on the outside that are the same size, and then 1 central one. So I've cut a length of wire for each. So obviously depending on what size you want your bowls to be, you need to use a different length of wire. Obviously just make sure that the 2 outside ones are the same length. And I am putting a bit of flux on there, and you see this time I used a spray bottle, quite handy to have as well. And all I'm doing here is heating up that wire with my torch, and I found to get a nice round ball, I keep the flame on the metal for a fair bit longer than when it's just melted. And the reason being for that is that it kind of starts to spin, and it gives you a really nice round little bead. You can see it takes a little while to cool down, and I don't pick it up until it's lost its red glow. The reason being that it can get distorted if you pick it up with your pliers. And there you go. That's what it looks like. So here I wanted to show you this from the side and a little bit of a close-up, just because it's so satisfying to do. So I'm putting the flame on it, and you can see I'm using my pick to get things moving, and I am just keeping the flame on it until it melts. And hopefully I'm trying to you can see how it's spinning from the side here, and I wanted to show you this. So I'm letting it cool down. You can see how it flashes across, and the it loses its color and hardens, and then that is when you can pick it up. So next we are going to, this is just an experimental thing, because obviously dirty materials, when your metal is dirty, the flux won't flow in there. So I tried something. I wanted to use a pencil and paint the area, scratch the areas where I don't want flux to go. So this is an experimental thing, because obviously you can do this when you sweat solder as well. You can sort of paint it around the edges of your work, and the flux will not flow where you have painted with the pencil. So I thought I'll give this a try here. When I put the sort of balls on the bottom, when I solder, so that the flux won't flow there. Don't know if it worked, but I gave it a try. So obviously next we are going to place the balls right where you want them to sit, and you want them to touch. As I said earlier, when you are soldering, there needs to be contact, and the metal needs to touch metal, as solder will not close off any gaps, so there needs to be touch. So I've set up my little balls, and I actually realized looking at it now, it's been off-centered then already, so I had to unsolder it later and resolder it, which is a whole story on its own. You can do it, but you have to clean everything up in between. So this was my spray bottle with the flux. It's really handy when you want to cover larger areas like this. And it prevents fire scale, and it sort of promotes the soldering. You need flux, otherwise your solder won't flow. So what I'm doing here is I'm picking up the tiniest paillettes of easy solder, and I'm placing it in between each joint where I want solder to flow. So you can see here, this is on the first ball, and I'm going to place solder wherever I want solder to flow. So one in between each ball, and then one where each ball sort of touches the gallery wire, and that's what it looks like. So the next step is obviously to bring in the heat, and I've got a little soldering pick which helps me, and I've got, as you can see in the background here, a third hand tool which keeps it in place while I apply pressure with my soldering pick.
I love using my charcoal brick.
So I am now pushing against the first ball. So I solder each ball in succession. When the first solder has flown, I move on to the next,
an oxygen-free atmosphere around the
There
solder,
are different methods to solder things like this. You can do investment soldering as well, which is really interesting. But for this, you can kind of do it manually like that. So you just control it with a soldering pick at the moment, and that works. So that's what it looks like. You can see the sort of silver flash where the solder has flown. I'm going to bring it a bit closer, and that's what it looks like so far. So the solder has touched on wherever I wanted to solder. So next we need to create the earring hoops. So what I'm going to do now is create a little coil spiral. So I'm using my bail mandrel. You can use anything you like, really. You can decide on how big you want the hoop to be, so that's entirely up to you. I think these ones are about 5 millimeters in diameter, but you can change. to whatever you like it to be. So all I'm doing here is trim off the coil, and I'm going to trim off one of the jump rings. I'm using the flat side of my flush cutters so that I get a nice smooth cut, which doesn't really matter actually, because we are going to still file the jump ring. So that's what it looks like, and we're going to place this on top where the bezel is. So next we are going to file, so I'm going to try hold on to this with a pair of pliers. The smaller it gets, the more fiddly it gets as well. So I'm filing the ends here at a slight angle. Obviously, as I said earlier, you need the best sort of possible surface contact area, big word that, to get the solder to flow and to stick. So I'm trying to zoom in here so you can actually see what I'm doing. And obviously you need to clean your pieces in between each soldering, or the solder won't stick otherwise. So I've sort of sanded this already, and we're going to solder these now. So again, this is my spray flux, really handy for bigger surfaces, and I have sprayed it on, and I'm going to use easy again for the top. Now, I mentioned in my other video that when you are using lower grade solder, there's also less of a silver content in your solder, so it can lower the value of your pieces. So, but obviously this is a copper piece, so it doesn't really matter. But when working with silver, you need to pay attention to that. I don't really know myself what the effects are of that, and I need to research it some more. So again, I've got my second hand tool, or third hand tool rather, and I am using a soldering pick to kind of put a little bit of pressure if necessary, but it seems to be okay. And you just want to make sure that you direct the heat all around the area and not just pointed onto the solder. You want the heat, you want the whole piece to heat up for an even flow of the solder. So that's what it looks like so far, and we need to give it a little bit of a clean. So for this, I'm using my radial brushes and my Dremel tool. These are really handy to have. Obviously, you can just use steel wool if you don't have any polishing tools. But if you do have a Dremel, this is really handy to have to get your polishing, because the little bristles go into all the little nooks and crannies that you normally can't get into. So that's really handy to have. Obviously, try not to put the speed too high up, otherwise they tend to kind of flake off and break. So go at a slow speed and take your time with that, and it looks really quite nice once you get the polishing done. And we need to do this before we actually set the stone. So next, this is what it looks like, and we're going to now set the stone. That's obviously the best part of the whole thing. So put your stone in there, make sure that it's nice and flat. And what I've got here is actually a graver. I do have a normal pusher, but I couldn't find it, but this works just as well. So this is a graver. You can also use a pair of pliers if you don't have a tool like that, because all you need to do really is bend the prongs against the stone. Now obviously the harder you press, and you kind of burnish the ends of the prongs so that they work hard, and you obviously want to make sure that they are nice and tight against the stone to prevent them from hooking onto your hair or clothing. So press them quite hard and kind of roll off them at the end to burnish them and flatten them against the stone nicely. And just go around them one more time, and that is looking good so far. So that's what it looks like. So the next step is obviously put them in your loss solution. So I have dipped them into my liver of sulfur. This is widely available on eBay or the internet or wherever you live. You just Google loss or liver of sulfur and you'll find it. You get liquids, you get gels, you get solid states, so you get loads of different options. And that's it. That's how I've made these gallery wire setting earrings. So thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this. As I said earlier, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love it if you pop by on any of my social media. I post loads of little sort of progress videos and mini tutorials on my Instagram page, which is Imbali Crafts. I've also got a Facebook page. And obviously, as I said earlier, if you want a little bit of community, come and visit my Facebook group. I'll pop a link in the description below. And lastly, obviously, if you need any square wire, half round wire, I've now got gallery wire and the beads listed in my shop, so I'll put a link there as well. So take a gander and see if there's anything that you fancy. And that's it. Thank you so much, and see you soon.